We are back with more of our conversation with Amal and George Clooney. Look at the way these two look at each other. I can't get over this. The power couple joined us in studio on a very big day for them. It was their 8th wedding anniversary.
George Clooney spent decades saying he would never marry again. Then Amal appeared, and suddenly Hollywood's most famous bachelor became a husband, a father, and a completely different man. But Brad Pitt knew George before all of that, and he noticed something the cameras missed. Amal did not just change George. She forced him to face the one thing he had spent his whole life avoiding. What happens when the charm stops working? The man who made loneliness look glamorous. Before Amal, George Clooney had turned bachelorhood into a brand. It was not just that he was single. Plenty of stars were single. George made it look like a philosophy. He had the villas, the motorcycles, the friends, the jokes, the confidence, and the kind of smile that made people believe he had life completely figured out. But Brad Pitt knew better. Brad knew that George's humor was not just humor. It was armor. Every sharp joke, every prank, every effortless appearance was a way of keeping the world entertained enough that nobody looked too closely. That was part of what made their friendship work. When Brad and George came together through the Ocean's films, Hollywood saw two impossibly handsome movie stars having the time of their lives. The press saw the banter. The fans saw the chemistry. The crew saw the practical jokes. But underneath that, Brad saw something more complicated. George was the kind of man everyone wanted around because he made life feel lighter. He had already been married once, to Talia Balsam, and that marriage had ended in 1993. After that, George seemed to draw a line through the idea completely. He dated, he was linked to famous women, and he had relationships that looked glamorous from the outside, including names like Elisabetta Canales, Renee Zellweger, and Jennifer Siebel Newsom moving through the public conversation around him. But nothing seemed to stay. And to Brad, that was the clue. George was not incapable of love. He was terrified of what love required after the charm wore off. The night at Lake Como that changed everything. The story has been told so many times that it almost sounds like a scene from a film. July 2013, Lake Como. George Clooney's home. A mutual friend asks if they can bring someone over. George says yes. Amal Alamuddin arrives on her way through Italy. And somehow, the man who had spent years avoiding marriage meets the woman who would make him rethink everything. The detail that always stayed with Brad was not that George met Amal. It was how quickly George changed afterward. At first, George tried to play it cool. That was what he did. He could turn anything into a joke. He could make even panic sound charming. But Brad had known him too long. He could hear the difference in George's voice. This was not another flirtation. This was a man who had finally met someone he could not impress with the usual tricks. Amal did not need his fame. She was not dazzled by the rooms he could enter. She was not waiting for Hollywood to approve her. She had her own life, her own work, her own moral center, and that unsettled George in the best possible way. For years, George had been the most interesting person in most rooms. With Amal, he had to listen. That was the first real reason Brad believed the marriage was different. Amal did not simply make George fall in love. She made him grow up. Their connection moved through emails, long conversations, and eventually that first date in London. To outsiders, it looked romantic. To Brad, it looked more like a man slowly realizing that the life he had defended for decades might not be enough anymore. The bachelor becomes a husband. When George proposed in April 2014, the image was almost impossible to reconcile with the old version of him. The man who had joked for years about never marrying again was suddenly on one knee, waiting for an answer from a woman who had managed to make him nervous. That alone told Brad everything. George Clooney did not get nervous easily. But Amal made him human. Then came Venice. The wedding in 2014 was everything the public wanted from a Clooney love story. The water, the boats, the elegance, the famous guests, and the old-world romance of Italy wrapping itself around one of Hollywood's most famous men. But the real moment was not the spectacle. It was the look on George's face. Brad had seen George win rooms, own premieres, charm journalists, and carry films with that relaxed movie star confidence. But standing beside Amal, George looked less like a legend and more like someone who had finally found a place to rest. And for a while, it seemed like that was exactly what happened. The bachelor became a husband. Then, in 2017, he became a father. And that was where the real test began. Because falling in love with Amal was one thing. Living every day as the changed version of himself was something completely different. When the fairy tale became a schedule, Ella and Alexander changed everything. For George, fatherhood was not just a new chapter. It was a new language. He had spent most of his life moving according to his own rhythm. Film sets, flights, premieres, writing, directing, dinners, long nights with friends. His life had been full, but it had been his. Twins do not care about rhythm. They create their own. Suddenly, George Clooney was not just the charming man at the center of a room. He was an older father, waking up in the middle of the night, learning the small humiliations and joys of parenthood, discovering that no award, no review, no career triumph can prepare a person for two children needing him at once. Brad found it funny at first. Of course he did. George panicking about diapers, sleep, and being outnumbered was too good not to tease. But beneath the jokes, Brad saw something tender. George was trying, not casually, not performatively, truly trying. He wanted to be a good husband. He wanted to be a present father. He wanted to prove that Amal had not made a mistake betting on him. But life was not simple. Amal's work did not slow down because she had married a movie star. If anything, her public profile made everything around her louder. She moved through legal cases, international conversations, human rights work, and high-pressure responsibilities that had nothing to do with Hollywood glamour. George's world moved differently. His commitments pulled him toward Los Angeles, Manhattan, Venice, Cannes, press tours, production offices, and film sets where everyone still expected the George Clooney they knew. The charming one, the available one, the one who made work feel like a party. At home, he was supposed to be something quieter. A husband, a father, a steady presence. That was the conflict Brad started to notice. The problem with a perfect marriage. George once said he and Amal did not really argue. To the public, that sounded romantic. To Brad, it probably sounded dangerous in a way most people would miss. Because Brad had been through enough life to know that silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence means two people understand each other so deeply that they do not need conflict. But sometimes silence means the difficult conversations are being postponed because nobody wants to damage the beautiful version of the story. That became the new insight Brad seemed to understand. The pressure on George and Amal was not that their marriage was secretly chaotic. It was that everyone needed it to remain graceful. But George and Amal were not just any couple. They were treated like proof that maturity, beauty, intelligence, fame, and purpose could all come together without friction. So what happens when friction appears? Where does it go? Brad knew that George's instinct was to protect people by saying less. If something hurt, George made a joke. If something scared him, George became charming. If something felt too emotionally exposed, he redirected the room until nobody noticed. That works in Hollywood. It does not always work in marriage. Amal's world was built on precision, argument, moral clarity, and seriousness. George's world was built on timing, instinct, deflection, and performance. Neither world was wrong, but they demanded different versions of him. With Amal, George had to be accountable in a way fame had never required. He could not just be loved for being entertaining. He had to be present. He had to listen. He had to show up for a life that was not arranged around him. Julia Roberts and the life George used to understand. George Clooney and Julia Roberts have always had the kind of chemistry Hollywood knows how to sell. It began with Ocean's 11, then continued through Ocean's 12, Confessions of a Dangerous Mind, Money Monster, and later Ticket to Paradise. Every time they stood beside each other, the room seemed to loosen. The jokes came easily. The timing was effortless. Their friendship had the warmth of people who did not need to explain themselves. That is what made the public so obsessed with them. But Brad understood the connection differently. Julia was not simply another woman in George's orbit. She belonged to the part of George's life where everything felt familiar. Movie sets, shared history, jokes that went back 20 years, the strange loneliness of being loved by millions but understood by very few. Julia knew that world because she had survived it too. She knew what it felt like to be turned into an image. She knew what it meant to be watched, praised, criticized, and remembered for a smile, even when life behind the smile was far more complicated. With Julia, George did not have to translate fame. He did not have to explain the absurdity of Hollywood because she had lived the same absurdity from the inside. That created a comfort Amal could never provide in the same way. Not because Amal was lacking, but because Amal represented a completely different world. With Amal, George was pulled upward into responsibility, seriousness, family, justice, and adulthood. With Julia, he was pulled backward into ease, laughter, memory, and the old rhythm of being George Clooney before marriage rewrote the role. That was the tension. The third presence Hollywood wanted to turn into a scandal. During the Ticket to Paradise period in Australia, that tension became easier for people to exaggerate. Julia was away from her own family for months. George brought Amal and the children with him. Their lives overlapped inside the strange bubble of filming during a difficult, isolated time. Julia later spoke about how much the Clooney family meant to her during that period. And that detail matters because it complicates the lazy version of the story. This was not Julia standing outside George's family. She was welcomed into it. The children knew her. Amal knew her. The friendship had warmth, history, and innocence on the surface. But Hollywood rarely allows warmth to stay innocent. The moment a man and woman have chemistry, the machine starts looking for smoke. And with George and Julia, the machine had decades of footage to work with. Brad had seen this before. Hollywood can take a genuine friendship and turn it into a courtroom where every gesture is put on trial. But that does not mean the connection was meaningless. The new truth Brad seemed to recognize was more subtle. Julia was not necessarily the reason George's marriage felt pressured. She was the mirror that showed how much George had changed. Around Julia, George could still become the old George, quick, loose, irreverent, youthful, untethered. Around Amal, George had become something deeper, a husband, a father, a man with responsibilities he could not charm his way out of. One version was easier, the other mattered more. And that is where the emotional danger lived. What Brad really saw, Brad Pitt was uniquely positioned to understand this because he was not just a co-star. He was a witness. He had known George before Amal. He had watched the Bachelor years. He had seen the jokes, the deflections, the fear of commitment disguised as confidence. Then he watched Amal arrive and change the entire emotional temperature of George's life. Brad also knew what it meant when a relationship became public property. He had lived inside one of the most analyzed romantic lives in modern Hollywood. He knew what it felt like for strangers to think they understood a marriage because they had seen photographs. He knew how quickly sympathy could become judgment, and how quickly love could become a storyline other people felt entitled to finish. So when Brad looked at George and Amal, he likely saw something the public missed. He did not see a simple fairy tale. He saw a man trying to protect a family while still carrying the habits of a man who had survived by staying emotionally mobile. That is the real reason this marriage fascinated him. George loved Amal. That was never the mystery. The mystery was whether George knew how to remain fully present in the life Amal had helped him build. Because falling in love is one thing, living as the changed version of yourself is something else. At Lake Como, George could be the romantic husband. In Venice, he could be the man who finally surrendered. In London, he could stand beside Amal's sharper, more serious world. In Los Angeles and Manhattan, he could return to the old machinery of fame. Around Julia, he could remember the life that had once felt effortless. Around Brad, he could admit things without fully saying them. But the question underneath all of it remained the same. Who was George when nobody was watching? The real reason. So what is the real reason behind George Clooney's marriage? It is not that Amal trapped him. It is not that Julia stole him. It is not that Brad uncovered some simple secret that makes the whole story collapse. The real reason is that Amal became the first woman who made George Clooney choose a life bigger than his image. That sounds beautiful, but it came with a cost. Because the image of George Clooney was easy to love. The real man was more complicated. He was older than the myth, more frightened than the smile suggested, more sentimental than the jokes allowed, and more dependent on the people he loved than he probably wanted to admit. Amal did not marry the poster. She married the man behind it. And marriage forced George to discover whether he could live without hiding behind the poster anymore. That is what Brad understood. The public wanted to know whether the marriage was perfect. Brad understood that perfection was never the point. The real question was whether George and Amal could keep choosing each other once the fantasy became logistics, children, distance, careers, exhaustion, and the quiet ache of two powerful people trying to meet in the middle. Julia Roberts enters the story because she shows the contrast. With Julia, George remembers who he was. With Amal, George confronts who he has to become. That does not make Julia the villain. It makes her the emotional echo. The familiar room, the old song, the person who can make George laugh in a way that looks suspicious only because the world has forgotten that deep friendship can be intimate without being destructive. But even an innocent connection can become dangerous if it becomes the place someone goes to avoid the harder work at home. That is the line Brad seemed to worry about. What happens now? Today, George Clooney's marriage remains one of the most watched relationships in Hollywood because it carries a story people still want to believe. Together, George and Amal built a family, a foundation, and a life that looked nothing like the future George once imagined for himself. But Brad Pitt's quiet understanding of that marriage adds a deeper layer. He does not see it as a fairy tale frozen in Venice. He sees it as a living thing, something that has to survive travel, age, parenthood, fame, public expectations, old friendships, private fears, and the dangerous comfort of becoming the person everyone expects you to be instead of the person your family needs you to become. That is why the real reason behind George Clooney's marriage is not just love. It is transformation. Amal did not simply become George's wife. She became the dividing line in his life. Before Amal, George could always return to the safe identity of the charming bachelor. After Amal, that identity no longer fit. He had children waiting for him. He had a wife whose world required seriousness. He had a home that needed more than charm. And he had friends like Brad who could see when the smile was doing too much work. Maybe that is why Brad's perspective feels so powerful. He is not judging George from the outside. He is recognizing him from the inside. He knows what it means to be loved as an image and still feel unknown as a person. He knows what it means to have the public turn private pain into entertainment. And he knows how easy it is for a man to mistake emotional escape for freedom. George Clooney's greatest challenge was never getting married. It was staying emotionally present after marriage took away the old hiding places. And maybe That is the part of the story Hollywood rarely understands. A perfect marriage is not one without tension. It is one where both people keep returning to the truth before the silence becomes too comfortable. For George, that truth may be simple, but frightening. Amal is not the woman who ended his freedom. She is the woman who showed him that freedom without emotional courage can become another kind of loneliness. And Julia, for all the speculation surrounding her name, may not be the great threat people imagined. She may simply be the reminder of the George Clooney who existed before responsibility, before fatherhood, before late-night worries about whether he was doing enough for the people who mattered most. Brad saw both versions, the man who could light up a movie set with Julia Roberts, and the man who looked at Amal Clooney as if she had reached a part of him nobody else could touch. That is the real story. Not a scandal, a choice. The choice between being admired by everyone and being known by one person. The choice between the comfort of the old self and the responsibility of the new one. The choice George Clooney has had to keep making every day since the night Amal walked into his home near Lake Como and quietly changed the ending he thought he had already written. So now the question is not whether George Clooney's marriage is perfect. The question is whether perfection was ever the right thing to ask from it. Because sometimes the most powerful love stories are not the ones without cracks. If you enjoyed this video, please like, add, subscribe.